All righty. Good evening, everyone. I'm Cameron Carlson, Dean for the College of Business and Security Management here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and it's my privilege to welcome you to tonight's event, Diplomatic Dialogue, a Conversation on Ukraine. First, we acknowledge the Alaska Native Nations upon whose ancestral lands our campuses reside. In Fairbanks, our Troth Yeddha Campus is located on the ancestral lands of the Dana people of the Lower Tanana River. On behalf of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, I want to extend my gratitude to our partners at the Alaska World Affairs Council. Their continued commitment to fostering informed global discussions make gatherings like this possible, and we are honored to collaborate with them again this evening. Tonight, we are fortunate to host two distinguished leaders whose careers reflect the highest traditions of public service and international diplomacy. First, Ambassador Mike Sfraga, former U.S. Ambassador at Large for Arctic Affairs and now Interim Chancellor of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Ambassador Sfraga has long been one of the leading voices in Arctic policy and international engagement. From founding the Wilson Center's Polar Institute to guiding U.S. and global discussions on Arctic governance, science, and security, his leadership continues to place Alaska and UAF at the heart of international dialogue in the Arctic. We are equally honored to welcome Ambassador William Taylor, whose remarkable career spans more than 5 decades of military service, diplomacy, and public speaking. A graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, Ambassador Taylor began his career as an infantry officer, serving in both Vietnam and Germany before turning his life to diplomacy and public service. Over the years, Ambassador Taylor has represented the United States in some of the world's most complex and challenging environments. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009 and returned as Charge d'Affaires in Kiev from 2019 to 2020, helping to guide engagement during pivotal moments in Ukraine's struggle for sovereignty and reform. His leadership has also extended to critical assignments as Director of the Iraq Reconstruction Management Office, Special Coordinator for Middle East Transitions during the Arab Spring, and as U.S. government's representative to the Middle East Quartet. Today, as a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council, Ambassador Taylor continues to shape policy and dialogue on democracy, security, and international cooperation. His breadth of experience from international cooperation in Afghanistan to Eastern Europe, from conflict reconstruction to democratic transition, offers a perspective that is rare as it is invaluable. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Mike Sfraga and Ambassador William Taylor for this evening's Diplomatic Dialogue, a conversation on Ukraine.
Thank you, Cam. Thank you, Dean Carlson. We appreciate that. Welcome, Fairbanks. Thank you for coming this evening. Bill, welcome to Alaska. We were in Anchorage. Welcome to the real Alaska.
The real Alaska.
I had to do that. I'm gonna put the first slide up. We've got 3 maps. We're gonna make this casual. We're gonna have questions. Bill and I just did this in Anchorage. It was a great conversation. We've taken him around the campus. He's visited our programs. He's met with students, our faculty. He's had a couple of dinners. He's getting the real Fairbanks thing, and he says it's way too warm here for him. And so, but we're sort of getting, Bill, we can't thank you enough for coming all the way here from America and visiting us in Alaska. Thank you for being here.
Mike, it's an honor. It's an honor to be here. It is a pleasure to be here. I had been in Alaska one time before, but not to Fairbanks. I'm delighted to be here. The people, I've met some people here that are here tonight. Thank you for coming again. And this is an opportunity for me to hear about the center of the Arctic universe, and really the key parts of the United States, right up here in Alaska. So I appreciate being here.
Thank you. when Bill accepted the invitation from our friends at the World Affairs Council, no joking around, in Anchorage, they extended the invitation to UAF, and we jumped on the possibility of bringing Bill north, first of what we hope to be many of our colleagues in the diplomatic corps. And I wanted Bill here for a number of reasons. Obviously, Ukraine, Russia, the world is turned upside down. These are very serious issues. We start out with a few jokes, but this is serious. And for those of us who think that these are disparate issues that don't impact us right here in Alaska or in Fairbanks, I think we're wrong. If you think that, they absolutely do impact us here. But we also have an influence what happens elsewhere in the world. So I wanted Bill here because of the incredible resume and his decades of service to our country. But I also wanted him here because, perhaps like many of you, I have watched Bill on television many, many times, and they're about 3 to 5 minute segments. Maybe they go a little bit longer across the networks. And every time they go to commercial, I about come out of my chair. And I say, but what about, I mean, there's so much more. So tonight's subtitle is going to be, yeah, but what about? Okay, so yeah, but what about? So we'll make this casual, but we have some maps for reference. Bill we'll go back and forth between some maps. So let's start off perhaps just laying some groundwork. The lead up to this war wasn't just about the war on Ukraine, wasn't just about the positioning of troops and armament. There was a long buildup over many, many years. Bill, set the context for what happened almost 4 years ago for us.
Well, almost 4 years ago, the Russians, President Putin, decided that he was going to invade Ukraine with an enormous military force. But, Mike, as you just indicated, that's not where it started. We all remember that the war started, that this active part of the war started in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. And Crimea is shown here on the map in the peninsula outlined in black and in stripes, the Crimean Peninsula. And in 2014, Putin invaded there. And then a little bit after that, a couple of months later, he invaded the other part that is in striped, red and black, we call Donbass. Oh, there we are. This is why he does this.
This is why he doesn't do it.
This is why he does this.
This is why you phone a friend.
That wasn't even, and Mike indicates that, and he's right, that it wasn't even that began this. We have to go back to President Putin, who has this obsession with Ukraine. He has this obsession with being seen in history, in Russian history, as a great Russian leader in the order of Peter the Great or Catherine the Great, or he would even put Joseph Stalin in the category of great Russian leaders. We would probably disagree with that latter for sure, but that's what Putin has been trying to do really since 2004, at least since 2004, when he tried to intervene in an election in Ukraine. Ukraine, I will make this point probably a couple times, Mike, is a real democracy. It's a raucous democracy. Are there Ukrainians in the room here? I'm hoping there will be some people. Good. Oh, very good. All right, there's one here, others. All right, so keep me honest on this thing. So I'm going to tell stories about your great country, and it's a wonderful country. It is a democracy. It's a raucous democracy. One indication of its democratic credentials, it's had 6 presidents. Russia since 2000 has had 1 president. You know, the presidents go back and forth. The Ukraine goes back and forth in deciding whether it's a president from the east or the west or the north or the south. It is a real democracy. And Putin doesn't like that because that is an indication of an independence, of a Europeanness of Ukraine that means that Putin can't control Ukraine. That's his goal. And Mike, you're right to ask the question, what's the context? The context is Putin's goal that he's pursued in several different ways is to dominate Ukraine or to eliminate Ukraine as a nation, as a people, as a culture. And that's what he's tried to do. He's tried to do it by interfering in the election in 2004. He's tried to do it by inserting some of his people inside of Ukraine and from 2014, 2022. Neither of those worked, so he invades. He invades, and that's where we are now.
Yeah. And but if you go back a little bit from there, I mean, and I want to get into sort of what was he thinking, but we'll get there in a moment. But is there a connection between the following events? So if you go to 2014 and Crimea, the year before, Yanukovych is president, 2013, and they're getting, and in Putin's mind, they're getting way too friendly with the EU, and it looks like maybe NATO might be, he doesn't, there are two arguments. One is you're getting too friendly with the EU, I don't want that, and NATO encroachment. So there's two things happening in 2013, and that there's a breakdown there. So it's 2014, 2013, 14's Crimea. But before that, in 2008, there's Georgia. So those are kind of connected, and I'm trying to connect some dots so you can give us the equal sign at the end and keep me honest. So in 2008, there's Georgia, but there's also Russian occupation in Moldova. There's cyber happening throughout the region. And before that, there is what I would just call meddling that goes way back, and I'll get to the Munich speech in a moment in 2007. But at least in my mind, there's a 2007 Putin Munich speech, there's a 2008 Georgia, there's occupation on the border with Moldova, there's Crimea, there's Yanukovych, and then there's Zelensky. And so these things are all connected to a crescendo of a major invasion. Am I right in lining all of those up? Are they connected?
Of course they're connected. Of course they're connected. And you can even take it back much farther than that. In Russian history, Europeans, in particular the Europeans that live close to Russia, know the Russians well. And we should listen carefully to the Poles. And the Finns, and the Latvians and Estonians, Lithuanians, who have lived next to and have experience with the Russians over, well, centuries, really centuries. And the Ukrainians point out, I have a T-shirt that the Ukrainian gave me, and it says, "Make Russia small again." And that's on the front. And on the back is a map of today's Russia, the borders of Russia. 11 time zones. Everybody in this room knows 11 time zones of Russia. And in 1465, Moscow, Russia, was this little teeny thing around Moscow. And so that is the history of Russia, into which, Mike, all of what you just described fits. It is an expansion, it's an empire, it's the Russian Empire, it's the Soviet Union. We can go into all the details of Transnistria, where they kept the Russians kept soldiers after the Soviet Union. There are all of these issues that the Russians have, but the overall approach is Russia has to dominate, and in particular, it's Ukraine.
Why? Why is Ukraine why is he so obsessed about Ukraine?
Zbigniew Brzezinski pointed out, I went to see him, so this was the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter and then on. A big thinker, Polish-American. He wrote good books about the great chessboard. And I went to see him before I went out the first time, 2006. And Zbigniew Brzezinski said to me, which he said before, but he emphasized that Russia with Ukraine, that is, if Russia dominates Ukraine, then it is an empire. It can continue to dominate. But Russia without Ukraine cannot be an empire and might be able to become a democracy. Putin is not interested in not he is interested in empire, not interested in democracy. Russia needs Ukraine for that kind of reason. It is an obsession. I'm not sure anybody can really, but people who know him better than I will talk about his need to go down in history as a great Russian leader, and that means he has to focus on Ukraine.
Because you would think that what we just laid out, he has troops in Moldova, there's occupation in Georgia, it's kind of piecing them out. He has all of Crimea. That's just not good enough for him, that's what you're saying.
It's not good enough because, again, his goal, which we just have to keep in mind, is not territory. It is dominating Ukraine. He wants Ukraine back into Russia. It's not, it's not these parts in red. I mean, he dominates that now. He occupies. The part in red represents about 19% of Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. So the Ukraine up there is 81% not occupied, 19% occupied, 90% is in pink. And Putin is not satisfied with that. There have been proposals, which we'll get to, Mike, I'm sure, about how this war ends. But there have been proposals, I think some Americans have made these proposals, that, well, if we just give Putin that part that he now occupies, if we just give him that, and then freeze the rest, then that will be fine. The Ukrainians should just give that up. Ukrainians say a couple of things. One is, they say, there are Ukrainians living in that occupied territory. So we're not just talking about land. We're talking about people. We're talking about citizens who are living there. And Ukrainians point out what happens to Ukrainians when they live under Russian occupation. And it's horrible. It is horrible. When the Russians invaded in 2022, they got close to Kyiv, the capital, and they occupied some towns around Kyiv. And we're talking about assassinations, we're talking about torture, we're talking about rape, we're talking about stealing children, kidnapping Ukrainian children, sending these kids, the Ukrainian kids, back into Russia to be made into Russian kids, giving them Russian names, making them speak, which is a war crime. We'll get to that too, I'm sure. But that's this obsession. That's this obsession. It's not just this area in pink. He wants it all.
He wants it all. So before we move on to the next line, I think I mentioned to you this before, and probably many of you have the same image seared into your mind that I have with those tanks and armaments in the first days of the war sitting without gas, like literally sitting ducks with the line, headed north, trying to go south, held off outside of Kyiv. What happened to the great Russian army, Air Force? Even to this day, I wonder. Last night was horrific throughout Ukraine. It was just horrific. But what happened? Did he totally miscalculate not only the ability of his own military, but the ferocity of the Ukrainian resistance? But that's got to be a pretty demoralizing scene for a leader to see his great army stalled out on a road trying to get to a capital that he thought he could take in, a day, 2 days, 3 days?
Yeah, 3 days. You're exactly right. You're exactly right. 3 big mistakes that a lot of people made in anticipation, looking at February 24th, 2022. That's the day that Putin sent his troops into Ukraine. Some people knew. Our intelligence in the fall of 2021, so leading up to the invasion in the early 2022, our intelligence was pretty good in one aspect. We had figured out from very good sources that the Russians were seriously planning on invading. And Bill Burns was the head of the CIA, was my boss in the State Department when he was a deputy secretary. His organization, plus others, other intelligence organizations in the United States, had made this point and briefed many people in Ukraine, including the military. And the military, this is important, actually, in answer to your question, the Ukrainian military took it seriously, but a lot of people didn't. A lot of people didn't. But that first decision, that first observation about what was he thinking goes to this first point. That is, Putin was going to invade. And he undoubtedly had been told that the Ukrainians were not going to resist. How he could have come to that conclusion is unbelievable.
Was it his inner circle?
It must have been his inner circle. And the other thing that people will say was this was not a military planned operation by Putin, by the Russian army, because there were no rehearsals, there was no preparation, there was no advanced training for these kinds of things. And they thought they could do this, as you just said, very quickly, because they didn't think they'd get resistance. And the Americans thought so too. Bill Burns got it right that they were planning to invade, but he got it wrong when he said, and he actually told the Ukrainians, that you're actually in trouble, he said to the Ukrainians. In fact, this is actually part of a good story. People may have heard the story, but it bears repeating. So, in that first couple of days when they invaded, when the Russians invaded, and they came from the north, they came from the east, they came from the south, up from Crimea, because they'd occupied that in 2014. But in 2022, when they invaded, they came down all the way to Kyiv. It's not shown on this map, but it was red all the way down to the capital. And it looked grim. And the Americans, again, who had earlier said, we think they're coming, you better get ready, and people didn't want to believe that. The Americans, probably our CIA, went into President Zelensky in the capital, in Kyiv, and said, Mr. President, you're in trouble. The Russians are outside the gates of Kyiv. We need you. We need you. Your country needs you to be able to lead them. We need you to lead them. So we can help you. We can move you to the southwestern part of the country. We can move you to Carpathian Mountains, where you'll be safer. Or we can even move you into Poland, we told him. The CIA told him. And President Zelensky said, famously, I need ammunition, not a ride. And by that, and our friend, our Ukrainian friend can corroborate, by that, determination to stay in Kyiv in the face of assassination squads in the capital after him, because the Russians' theory of victory was get rid of Zelensky, put our puppet in there, take over the country. And Zelensky stayed in the country, right in the capital. He stayed in the capital. And with that, he galvanized the Ukrainian military. He galvanized the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people have supported him and the military overwhelmingly. And they stopped the Russians. They stopped the Russians. So Putin misunderstood the Ukrainians. He didn't think they would resist. We didn't think they would be able to resist. The Ukrainians obviously did. And they resisted, and they have held this line. This line here, Mike, you could have shown this line 2.5 years ago.
Yeah, this is as of yesterday.
This is as of yesterday. Yeah. But virtually the same map would have been accurate, was accurate, 2.5 years ago. That is, the Ukrainians have held these lines, have held off the Russians for virtually 2.5 years. They've pushed it back. Now, the Russians, admittedly now, are making little progress. Piece by piece, small village by small village, meter by meter, bridge by bridge. at enormous cost in terms of Russian lives. So we're talking about 1.2 million Russian soldiers either killed or taken off the battlefield by wounds. It's an enormous cost, but they are grinding forward. They're not making big gains. They're not making big strategic gains. They're holding them off.
The numbers are staggering, right? Over 1 million. And then what's the Ukrainian numbers?
Probably half that.
Probably half that. But on scale, I mean, they are...
There are more Russians than there are Ukrainians.
Right, and on scale, and they're just wave after wave. Last night was, every night's horrific in Ukraine. Last night was horrific. But I'm thinking about this, what's your take now on how this thing progresses? Because they are taking some towns. I mean, their deal is here to like totally demolish small little towns and then take it over. There's nothing left, but basically take the supply line, take the roads. In Donbass, I mean, they're losing 20,000 Russians killed a month-ish. I mean, you know, it's tough to stomach rounding off death. But that's the scale at which this is just for these small pieces of ground. But is the theory, Bill, that they could link these small little towns, expand the supply lines at an enormous cost, because then that's the road to Kharkiv. Those are the roads
Mike,
to Kyiv.
I think the theory is simpler. I think Putin's theory is he can wait us out. He can keep grinding. He can keep sending Russian soldiers. You're right, it's 1,000 a day. It's 30,000 a month that he's losing. But he'll keep doing that with the theory. I mean, his theory of victory is he's got more soldiers than Ukrainians. He thinks that the Ukrainians will sometime crack. He's going after their energy distribution, generation facilities. He's trying to destroy the Ukrainian morale, trying to do that, so that they'll crack. And he thinks he can wait out until that happens. He thinks the Europeans will back down, and thus the threats to the Europeans to try to keep them from supporting Ukraine. He thinks the Americans will stop supporting. Putin thinks that he can wait us all out. The Ukrainians have demonstrated that they will never stop. They will never stop. The Europeans have stood up, have even stood up more strongly, actually, than we have right now. And we continue. We're going to get, I'm sure, into our current U.S. policy.
Yes.
And this administration, the Trump administration, and President Trump himself. We're still strongly supporting the Europeans as they support the Ukrainians. We still strongly support the Ukrainians. When you ask the American people, they say the same thing. When you ask the United States Senate, there's a bill in the United States Senate that has 85 co-sponsors to put sanctions on the Russians. It's an indication of the strong support that we continue to provide to the Ukrainians. But Putin thinks he can wait us out. And we have to change that. I mean, again, we'll get into this. How does this end? We're going to get into that. But we have to demonstrate to Putin, we have to convince Putin he cannot win. He can't wait us out.
So I want to let's jump forward a little bit, and then we'll jump back, and we'll take questions. Because there's a couple, if I'm out, I'm sitting here, but if I'm out in the audience, I want to know how it's not helpful to have a shouting match in the Oval Office.
Yep.
What signal does that send to the battlefield, to the Ukrainian government, to Zelensky? What does it send to Putin? What does it send to Xi Jinping? What signal is that? Because we're saying we have to stand up to him, yet we heard an administration tell this president, you have no leverage, you have to make a deal. What goes through the mind of the leader of Ukraine? And then we'll talk about it, and then link the administration's policy to it.
So the administration policy has changed over time. That Oval Office disaster, where Vice President and President told President Zelensky he didn't have the cards, he didn't have the leverage, as you just said. That was a low point, there's no doubt. Since then, there have been better meetings with Zelensky. Since then, there have been some sanctions put on Russia. Since then, there have been discussions of more weapons and how to provide these weapons, have the Europeans buy them from the American manufacturers and give them to the Ukrainians. Since then, the Europeans, as I mentioned a minute ago, have stepped up in terms of being ready to provide military assistance to the Ukrainians on the ground once the fighting stops. And in that conversation, President Trump said, we'll support that with air power. You're exactly right. The message that Oval Office meeting in the Oval Office in February was demoralizing for the Ukrainians, encouraging for the Russians, encouraging for the Chinese, and others who would like for Russia to break these rules, for Russia to go ahead. And since then, all those audiences have been worried, disappointed, because gradually, not smoothly, but gradually and jaggedly, the support for Ukraine has gone up out of the White House. And that's where the policy is made. That's just a fact of life today. That's where the policy is made. And that policy right now is not where it was in February. It is much better now than it was. One of the jagged bits, and I was in Anchorage, we were in Anchorage together, and everybody remembers that meeting, the Anchorage summit. And again, Ukrainians were not so happy about that. Again, our Ukrainian friend can give us his
How
view.
did that come about, Bill? Who thought that was a good idea?
Putin.
Putin thought it was a good idea.
Putin thought that was a good idea, and he convinced Steve Witkoff, who is the special envoy, Trump's special envoy. Witkoff misunderstood what Putin said. Putin said to Witkoff, I would like to end this war, and I'm ready to make a deal and compromise. And Witkoff went back and told President Trump that, and President Trump said, is he really willing to make a deal, really willing to negotiate and end this war? Well, if he is, let's have a meeting, and we'll have the meeting in Anchorage, Alaska. And they get to Anchorage, Alaska, and they get in the room. They had planned, everybody in Alaska knows.
We heard a thing or two about it.
You heard a thing or two about this meeting, and you all remember that the plan was that they would have a meeting, and then they would come out. Then they would come out and have a long lunch. Yep. And they would talk about economic deals and this kind of business because there were some economic officials there, and the lunch would discuss that. And then they would have what President Trump loves to do is a press conference. And they would take questions, and Putin would probably get his chance to answer questions, and President Trump would his. That's not what happened. That's not what happened. What happened was President Trump, President Putin get in that room in Anchorage, and President Putin lays out what his real position is and has been. This is what he told Witkoff, but what Witkoff got wrong, misunderstood, bumbled, frankly. But Putin made it very clear to President Trump that he's not interested in ending this war on anything other than terms that call for Ukraine to capitulate. And Putin said that again in that closed meeting. This was not what President Trump thought he was going to hear from President Putin. So, again, as all Alaskans know, that meeting went short. President Trump called a shorter meeting, called it off. They canceled the lunch. Canceled the lunch with all this economic talk was going to happen. Canceled. That didn't happen. They came out. You watched it. Some of you live, I'm sure, in person. And President Putin made the first statement. That was a little odd. And it was kind of long, but about 9 minutes. It wasn't this. And then President Trump came up and said not very much and cut it off. No questions. That is another indication of the increasing support for Ukraine by President Trump. And another indication of what President Trump has finally figured out about Putin. Putin is not serious. Putin wants Trump to think he's serious about ending this war. He's not. And President Trump has figured that out. And that's why he was talking about providing these long-range weapons, the Tomahawks. That's why he's put on these heavy sanctions on the Russians just in the past month. That's why he's making commitments to the Europeans to back them up when they put forces on the ground in Ukraine. So that's why I say that support for Ukraine from the White House, which is important, has been going up since the nadir back in February.
This is why we need like 5 hours to have these discussions, because we did this in Anchorage and we could just keep going. I want to ask maybe one more question and ask you to think about your questions. I think we might have some high school students here and also university students, and I would ask that we give them a chance to ask a question first, and we'll do questions for the rest of the time. I think that would be good, but I would be remiss. I mean, we can talk about Oval and we can talk about Zelensky. I wanted to talk about how Zelensky thinks. I mean, how does this man keep this country together through all sorts of, I mean, he's trying to run a country so that they actually can have a country and also defend against, the Russians. But I would be remiss if I didn't go back to the phone call, the famous phone call. And to me, the sense of stress and frustration, you could see that played in that famous Oval, I was going to say engagement, but argument. But I wonder how much of that is personal from what happened during that phone call, which you were there to see this thing play out in real time. Give us a little peek into that perfect phone call and how that played out and how it's played out to this day.
So just to remind, back in 2019, so in the first Trump administration, President Zelensky had just been inaugurated. That's, again, when I got there in the summer of 2019. And President Trump and President Zelensky got on a phone call. President Zelensky had been interested in two things. One was a meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office. But more important than that, that would have been a good symbol, but more important than that symbol were additional weapons. And in 2019, okay, this is now, 3 years before the big invasion, but 5 years after the first invasion in 2014. So, and the Ukrainians have been fighting for 5 years by this time, and we had been providing weapons and training and support to the Ukrainians to build them up, to be able to defend themselves against the Russians. And so President Zelensky did want meeting and additional weapons. And President Trump said in that phone call, I need you to do us a favor. Do an investigation of one of my political rivals and his son. And President Zelensky did not, and that led then to a very great concern on the part of a lot of people, when in fact that military support was paused, was held up. And so Zelensky then, in the end, after the whistle had been blown, later, a month or two later, Zelensky did get his meeting, and the weapons were resumed. The weapons flow resumed, and that was that. So then your question, Mike, is whether or not that played into, or that was related to, the bad meeting in the Oval Office 4 years later. I don't know. That bad meeting in the Oval Office didn't have to be bad. It did not. That was designed actually to be an agreement on minerals. I mean, Alaskans know something about strategic minerals. And this was meant to be a deal between the Ukrainians and the Americans on how to develop strategic minerals, and it went off the rails for reasons that we can talk about. The vice president kind of provoked it.
Yeah. Okay, I lied. I have one more question. Weapons, I don't understand. I think if you gave the Ukrainians the Tomahawks, they would threaten energy infrastructure inside of Russia even more than they are today. The most innovative, Operation Spiderweb and those kind of things, and those innovative war fighting in modern days come out of Ukraine with all sorts. James Bond kind of stuff is happening. Maybe you can talk just a second or two about that. But if you gave them the Tomahawks, you would hurt Russia even more on their energy infrastructure, their roads, that you can dig deeper. And just the idea of a Tomahawk brought Putin back to a table. Just even the idea that we would give them Tomahawks brought him back to the table to delay, not to negotiate, but to delay. It seems to me that there's another lever here, and we haven't totally used the economic lever through energy. The shadow fleet that takes Russian oil around the globe and is sold, that is accounting for the majority of Russia's cash being sold in old tankers, which worries us because of the Bering Strait, but it worries us globally. It seems to me if we seriously went after the shadow fleet, particularly in the Baltic, we could seriously affect Putin's ability to wage war. Am I right? Am
Yes.
I wrong? And why haven't we collectively done that?
Because the goal is, Mike, and it's exactly what you say, the goal is to cut off the flow of revenues, of money that Putin gets from the sale of oil and gas. The Russians sell oil and gas around the world, a lot through that shadow fleet, and if you can cut that off, and that's what these sanctions did against the two largest oil companies 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago now, is to cut off that flow of money into Russia so we can do that. Shadow fleet is a way that the Russians are getting around these sanctions. They're getting around these sanctions. And yeah, absolutely. And the Europeans, again, are ahead of us on cracking down on that shadow fleet because it's through their waters too, just like through the Bering Strait.
Yep.
It's also through the European waters. The answer is yes, they can use that leverage.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have some time for questions. I've got a lot, but please take advantage of this opportunity. Oh yes, our student body president. Please, we have microphones right here. Excellent, thank you. Maybe first name, I don't know, maybe a major, what your major is, and if you can, your bank account number really slowly.
All right, my name's Jackson. I'm studying business and comp-sci here at UAF, and I'm joined here by lots of our student government here today. But I just wanted to express that, when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I'm not so much worried about Russia themselves, but I'm more concerned about Russia and their alliances. And so I'm curious about your perspective on the strategic implication of China and Russia's partnership. Specifically, how should we think about their alliance compared to the collective strength of NATO and the other Western nations?
Jackson, great question. Thank you. So the Russia-China relationship is an interesting one. I'm glad you raised that. They wish it were like NATO. They wish it was as strong as credible as durable as NATO. So NATO's been around since, 1949? And those now 32 nations have committed to defend each other if attacked. That's not what we see in the Russia-China relationship. What we see in the Russia-China relationship is rhetorical support from China to Russia. China is clearly the big brother of this relationship, and Russia is now, they don't like this. Putin doesn't like this, being the little brother, but he is, and knows it. And the big brother, little brother have said to each other, we have a partnership without limits. That is, they have a rhetorical agreement. China is supporting Russia rhetorically. They're not selling weapons. Again, this goes to the question of NATO versus this Russia-China relationship. NATO is providing incredible number of weapons support. Hundreds of billions of dollars going from NATO nations, Americans, Europeans, to Ukraine, and no weapons, zero weapons from China to Russia. Zero. The only people that will sell Russia weapons are the Iranians. They got other problems right now, and the North Koreans. And that's, when you compare that to the NATO alliance, the strength, the military and economic capabilities of the NATO alliance with North America and Europe, and then you add in Japan and South Korea and Australia and New Zealand, there's not a comparison. Again, the Chinese and the Russians in particular would love to have that kind of a relationship. They don't. And when Donald Trump talks to President Xi, and they make some progress, in trying to work out some of the problems, the tensions in the US-China relationship, that makes Russia, Putin in particular, really nervous. He's really nervous. Putin needs China on his side. And China needs Europe and needs the United States, markets, so much more than he needs Russia. He would like to see Russia win, or at least not lose. But he's not doing very much now. He's selling chips, selling dual-use items and even machines to the Russians. But he's not providing the military capabilities in this thing. So it's a very interesting question on the China one. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, great question. Another question, please.
Hello, Ambassador Taylor. I'm Curtis Beck, and I'm a mechanical engineer, and I'm 19 years old. The U.S. ended nuclear testing in 1992. I was born in 2005, so I don't have the same generational context as you. Why do you think Russia has not used tactical nuclear weapons, even though they're permitted in their doctrine?
Curtis, great question. I get this a lot. It's not a hard question, though, I will tell you. I'm glad you asked it. Tactical nuclear weapons make no sense. You're right, that their doctrine would allow them to do it. Our doctrine allows them to do it. We don't do it. Neither side does it. No one uses nuclear weapons because, in the tactical sense, in Ukraine, it has no military value. The line now, the line of contact, you know, it's very long. It's 1,000 kilometers. It's actually more than that when you extend it up. In order to have an effective, militarily effective weapon, nuclear weapon, you have to have a big target. And the Ukrainians are well spread out along that line. There's no target that merits the use of a nuclear weapon. Militarily, number one. Politically, if Putin were to decide to use a tactical nuclear weapon, he would face incredible opposition, even from his own people. He hasn't gotten much opposition so far to this war. But if he were to use a nuclear weapon, break that taboo against Ukraine, which the Russians used to think were their brothers and sisters and cousins. And if Putin decides to use a tactical nuclear weapon, he's going to get real hard blowback from his own people, number one, and also from the Chinese. So Jackson asked about the Chinese. President Putin has threatened a couple of times. He's rattled the saber, as we say. He's rattled the nuclear saber a couple of times. And he said, don't forget, I've got nuclear weapons. So you Europeans and you Americans should not be supporting Ukraine because I've got nuclear weapons and I can do bad things. When President Xi heard President Putin say that, President Xi told Putin, shut up. He said, the Chinese told the Russians, shut up. Don't even talk about using nuclear weapons. The Chinese don't want to hear it. And they don't want to hear their partner with unlimited partnership talk about that. And he's piped it down as well. So my own view is there is no military value. There's a strong political case against it, not just domestically, but also internationally. And for him to use that would be a blunder, would be another blunder that Putin would. Now, all that said, and I'm glad you asked this question, all that said, you can't say it couldn't happen. You can't say it wouldn't happen. What the United States has said, to be sure that Putin understands the consequences of using a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, is there would be catastrophic consequences for whatever Russian military unit used a nuclear weapon. They don't think that's going to happen. They think it's very low. I mentioned Bill Burns earlier, the head of the CIA. He said that risk that you rightly ask about, Curtis, is very low. And we should not have allowed, we took it too seriously earlier on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Another question? Sure, just come on up.
Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm a social work major. And I've talked a lot about this with my mom and family members. And every time we talk about it, my parents inevitably bring up and my grandma often does too, should Russia, on the off chance they do take Ukraine, move into Poland, and that's starting World War III? And I'm just wondering, like, is that something people are worried about? Is that a threat we need to be thinking about? Or is that just, like, catastrophizing elderly family members?
No. That's a
We
serious.
resent your statement.
Sophie, that's a perfectly serious question. The answer to the first part of your question, that is, will Putin go further? If he were to win, if the Ukrainians stop fighting, if the Europeans give up, if the Americans quit supporting Ukraine, then it'll be very hard for Ukraine to be able to stop the Russians in Ukraine. And if the Ukrainians don't stop the Russians in Ukraine, then they will be exactly what you're asking about. They'll be on the Polish border, and they'll be on the Latvian border, which they now are. So it is certainly the case that people worry about it's certainly the case. This is one of the strongest reasons why we're supporting Ukraine, because we don't want them to allow the Russians to get all the way to the Polish border, because it's a serious question. But the second part of your question, is that a catastrophe? It's a catastrophe that would be a catastrophe for the Ukrainians, clearly, for the international order that the Russians have broken the taboo, the principle that has kept the peace up until 2014. That is, you don't invade your neighbor. You know, that big nations, small nations are sovereign. You know, they have boundaries. You don't invade them. And Putin broke that. If he gets away with that by the scenario that you talked about, that is, you know, winning in Ukraine, then we're all in trouble. And then the big question is, will Putin go further and attack Poland or attack Estonia? The answer, I believe, is no, because deterrence works. NATO is strong. Putin knows that if he attacks a NATO member, that he will lose. He will lose. And that's very clear to him. So, but he'll be right on that border. And we don't get to that point. We want to be sure the Ukrainians can stop him where they are now, stop him right here. And that's why it's a good question you ask. Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you. Had one more, had somebody else come up? Yeah, please.
Hello, my name is Quillian Anderson. I'm 19 years old.
First name is what, I'm sorry?
Quillian.
Quillian,
Yeah.
all right.
And I'm a fisheries and marine science major. In the opening days, the West was very concerned about nuclear escalation with Russia, and has still been so. There was concern about tanks for a while. The UK finally broke the taboo by sending 2 challengers. Then there was the F-16 debate, then the Storm and Scalp cruise missile debate. The French have teased sending in soldiers to Ukraine, as in non-combat roles. I'm wondering, how do we deal with Russian and Chinese aggression in the future? Should the West respond with like, or should it respond with more escalation than it receives to deter further escalation?
Well, the last sentence is exactly what I would say, and that is to deter. We have to make it very clear to the Russians and the Chinese. You're exactly right, that it would be a terrible mistake for them to invade. It would be a terrible mistake. They would, again, as I said to Sophie, they would lose. They have to be convinced of that. So NATO has to be strong. NATO has to be unified, as it is now. Ukraine has to continue to be able to stop the Russians. And if that deterrence is very clear, then that exactly what you said, deterrence will stop them from doing that. Mike, were you going to go add something to that?
No, that's perfect. Peter, do you want to come up and ask a question while Peter's getting to the microphone? It's right there. On your right, you can do that one. Or maybe bring one to you. No? Okay, go through the aisle. I was just going to note that our friend and colleague Mark Brzezinski was our ambassador to Poland in Warsaw. You noted his father's big, right? We followed Zbig and Mark and Ian. But Mark was dealing with refugees across the border and the position of the United States inside of Poland as a NATO partner, trying to figure out deterrence, how far this was coming in. So he was dealing with a whole lot to the point of trying to destabilize a NATO country, driving people out, but also there was a destabilization as well, trying to take in refugees as trying to a security architecture in an evolving situation where we thought within days Kyiv would fall. They are connected. Now we got drones crossing into borders across many countries in Europe. It just keeps probing. And even though deterrence works, the Russians are still probing in many ways: cyber, maybe refugees, drones, airplanes across borders. And if there wasn't deterrence, it'd be a very different thing. Right?
Deterrence is really important. We have to contain the Russians. Sir.
Peter.
Thank you very much for honoring us by your presence. I've enjoyed it so much. My question is, Mike knows me. I travel all over the world. I went to Poland when the war broke out. I was in the Baltic states in '24. And so my question is, you mentioned Mr. Witkoff. I followed this very, very closely. He's not a diplomat, and I just want to mention one thing. Early in the negotiations, he said a famous artist in Russia painted a painting of Mr. Trump, and I've got to present this to Mr. Trump. And a lot of people are not aware, Putin was with the Stasi in East Germany before the wall fell. I was there in '85. He was a colonel in the KGB. He's a very, very good negotiator. He's very crafty. And I feel, let you comment on our current negotiators. For example, Mr. Witkoff, who's not a diplomat. He's a real estate mogul. Do you feel this has a direct impact on our negotiations, the lack of experience?
I do. It's Peter. All right. Yeah. Thank you, Peter. I do. I think it has had a negative impact on us because exactly what you said. Putin is he's evil, but he's not stupid.
Oh no.
And he has been able to play President Trump in making President Trump think that he's ready to negotiate, and that's that earlier program. That, of course, led to the Anchorage summit. I think President Trump has figured it out. And I think Mr. Witkoff is no longer, he's doing some other things. He's working on the Middle East. And I hope he's been taken off this account that we're talking about here. Because, as I said, I think from a low point in February, that horrible Oval Office meeting, it has been gradually getting better. That is, the support for Ukraine from the White House, from President Trump, has been getting better, even though, in spite of, I would say, Steve Witkoff. There are other people now who are more engaged and more involved and more influential and having a bigger effect on U.S. policy. Let's be clear, President Trump makes the policy, there's no doubt about it, but we now have a Secretary of State. As you said, Mr. Witkoff is a real estate developer. Secretary of State is a professional, and he is more engaged, and he was Secretary of State, so Marco Rubio was responsible for canceling, or getting President Trump to cancel that proposed meeting in Budapest, which Steve Witkoff had proposed. So again, I think it's going in the right direction, and it has to do with the advisors in the White House. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Next question. If it's okay, we're going to go for a few more minutes. Is that all right? Okay. Please.
Good evening, Ambassador. My name is Carl.
Carl?
I was in the Army for 8 years. I was deployed to OIF 3 and OEF 9.
Thank you for service.
Thank you.
My question is about basically elections in Russia, and kind of we'll segue into something else. Now, I've read online that Putin tends to get like 70 to 80% of the vote, which is pretty dang high, although that is debatable, apparently, with talk of fixed elections and whatnot. So what do you think would be a more legitimate indicator of actual Russian support of Putin and the war from the citizens of Russia?
Carl, it's a good question. I'm not a Russia expert. I mean, I will, cop to that right away. But your question is a very good one about, and we can even compare the elections in Russia and the elections in Ukraine. I've already mentioned that there's been one president, consistent with your question, in Russia since the year 2000, and it's been Putin. And, by the way, he's changed the Constitution so he can stay in office until 2036. So we're going to have Putin, unless he dies, until 2036. Because, exactly what you say, he'll be elected every time. They're not elections. They're not elections, and they're not serious elections in Russia. And you're right to ask the question about what do the Russian people really think? And it's hard to tell. I'm frankly disappointed that the Russian people are not more angry about what their government is doing to them. I mean, there are 1.2 million dead or very seriously wounded Russian soldiers. So that means there are 1.2 million Russian families who have been directly affected by this war. For what? What have they gotten for this war? They should be angry, but they don't seem to be. They don't seem to be angry. And, you can't tell about polls, Russian polls. I mean, if you get a phone call that says, do you support President Putin? It's a hard question. But the Russians have not stood up. There may be some people in this room that can answer this better than I, some Russian Americans or Russians that want to have this thing. Mike, you may have a sense of this, but I think that it's hard to tell what the Russians think.
Yeah, thank you. We have 1, 2, 3. Let's do 3 more questions. We come here.
Good evening. My name is Gary. I'm a part-time graduate student in Arctic Security Studies. Ambassador Taylor, you might not remember we met last year in the U.S. Institute for Peace when I was at USAID. I was working on Ukraine energy.
Thank you. Good memory.
I think what struck me most about USIP was the programming that would connect to people. I think, respectfully, I would disagree. I think there are Russian dissidents that are being crushed by the authoritarian and military law that is there right now. I would wonder, in Russia, yes.
Yeah.
And in my abbreviated time as a diplomat, I've always kind of lived by the maxim: you can hate on the government, your counterpart. They might be, negotiating in bad faith, but the people are generally like people everywhere. They are kind, they are friendly, and they suffer when governments disagree. And so, what I would ask is, I think Russians that disagree with the war are probably losing out the most out of all this, not including the Ukrainians, of course. But what sort of programming or connections that you think people to people can make from, say, Alaska, who has, where we do have connections historically with Russia?
I agree with you, Gary, about the generally good nature of people and individuals. Russians, we all know Russians. I know Russians. Mike worked with Russians, and Alaska has neighbors. I take your point, and I'm talking more about the level of oppression in Russia today that keeps those Russian people who have lost sons and fathers and brothers, and yet are not in the streets. They're not expressing concern about this. But nonetheless, they could be working on some things together with international, maybe Americans, or this kind of thing. The problem is the Russian government doesn't let them do that. The Russian government today, as we were talking about this yesterday, has kicked out USAID a long time ago. The Russians kicked the USAID out of the country a long time ago. They kicked out the Peace Corps. They've kicked out. This is all before the big war. This is all just because the Russians or this administration, the Putin administration, does not want this kind of people-to-people connections. So it's gonna take a change. It's gonna take a serious change, I think, on that, Gary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One more question, and then we'll have the last question, and then I'll do a wrap-up. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't feel comfortable to give my name, but I am a UAF student. I think it's a bit strange that this event is called a diplomatic dialogue when there's no representation for the other side in this conflict here today. And also, I think that in your background to this conflict that you gave, Ambassador, you mentioned Russian imperialism and Putin interfering in the elections in 2004 and taking over Crimea. But I think it's interesting that you left out any mention of what the US was doing all along during this time in Ukraine. And so to this end, I'd like to just reference this article. It's from The Guardian from 2004, and it's titled, US Campaign Behind the Turmoil in Kiev. This article admits that the US, using CIA front organizations, funded the so-called Chestnut Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, as it did for 3 other so-called grassroots campaigns to, quote, topple unsavory regimes in Belgrade, Georgia, and Serbia within a period of 4 years. And it seems like maybe they were a bit premature with this article because, as we know, subsequently Yanukovych was reelected on a platform of enshrining Ukrainian neutrality. And then, as you acknowledged, the CIA was deeply involved with directing practically every aspect of Ukrainian military and intelligence operations in the Donbass from 2014 up until the launch of Russia's special military operation.
So let me respectfully interrupt you and ask for you to ask a question of the ambassador. So what would be the question?
Okay, so my question is, given what you acknowledged and what I just said, if this was, imagine if this was Russia in Canada, overthrowing the Canadian government and then building military bases along the Canadian border with the US and, training commandos to enter across into the US and talking about positioning long-range missiles aimed at cities in the US.
Okay.
Would the US tolerate that? And if not, then why would we expect
Okay, that's
Russia
the question.
to?
Thank you. Okay, good. Go ahead, Ambassador, please. Thank you.
This is why we have open
these
conversations.
discussions.
This is why you can ask whatever questions you want, and you can cite whatever issue, whatever sources you want. It's a fair point. What I will say, without going into any of the long list of details that you were asking about, is that we do have a stake. We have a strong stake in a democratic, free, independent Ukraine. And that's what we've been supporting since they became independent from the Soviets. And we've provided ammunition, we've provided guidance, we've provided support when the Ukrainians want it. We have not been pushing the Ukrainians toward anything that they don't want. And so that has been what's motivated our situation. Now, it's not out of altruism. That's not because it's certainly not because we're always right, and I will certainly admit to having made mistakes. I've made mistakes, U.S. government's made mistakes, Americans have made mistakes, no doubt. But I do believe that our intentions, in particular, I was talking about Ukraine now, we can talk about Afghanistan or Iraq, but I'm talking about Ukraine. Our intentions are to help the Ukrainians get to where they want to be, which is a European independent nation. Sovereign, that they can make their own decisions. And that's what we've been trying to do. Made mistakes, you bet. But that's what we've been doing. And I think that the United States will be better off if Ukraine can stop the Russians where they are. You want to say something about that?
One more quick question, and then I'll do a wrap-up.
Hello, my name's Stuart. I'm a UAF student. My major is history. I wanted to go back to what you were talking about on the economic levers and how they aren't really being pulled right now. Once those do start being pulled, and given the position that Putin outlined in Anchorage, where it's pretty much all or nothing, what do you think a wind down of the war will look like? Because inevitably it will have to wind down, I assume.
It will. It will. Stuart, I think you're exactly right. It will wind down. And I think it'll be a combination of the economic measures that you mentioned, which I'll talk about in just a sec, with the military method, with the weapons that Mike mentioned, the Tomahawk weapons and others. Because the way it's going to wind down is Putin's going to realize that he can't win. He's going to realize that when the revenues that Mike talked about earlier are squeezed off through the shadow fleet or through these sanctions that President Trump has put on the two largest oil companies in Russia 3 weeks ago now. That squeezing of revenues, that cutting off of the shadow fleet, the $300 billion of support for Ukraine, and the weapons will convince Putin that he can't win. And then he will have to figure out how he talks to the Russian people and tells them that actually he got what he wanted. But I think that is the answer to the question of how this happens. And then the Ukrainians, like the South Koreans, where there was not an agreement, there was not a peace agreement. There's still no peace agreement between North Korea and South Korea. But the South Koreans have gone on to develop their economy and develop their democracy, an independent nation. The Ukrainians can do that. If we can all unite to stand Putin down in answer to your question, so that he's convinced, he figures out, he has to accept that he can't win, then they can stop the fighting. They can have an armistice. And then, like South Korea, Ukraine, that 81% that is not red can get into the EU, eventually get into NATO, can have elections, could develop, again, their civil society, their democratic institutions. They can go on about the business. And then, like East Germany, West Germany never gave up on getting back East Germany, even though the Soviet Union dominated it. And the Ukrainians know that history too. Even though West Germany, like the 81% here, didn't have East Germany for a long time, they got it back. And the Ukrainians, they are convinced, will get back that 19% at some point. So my sense is, to answer your question, that's how it would wind down.
Okay, thank you. And I wanted to thank you and the Chancellor for having this dialogue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great questions. It's a circle here. Coming back to how we started all of this, watching television, your interviews and me asking the television, yeah, what about? Wait, don't go to break. Bring Bill back on. Bill, thank you for answering, a few of the questions about what about. Thank you for coming to Fairbanks. We very much appreciate it. I think what you provided for us was sort of the connective tissue of the issues for us. We read, we're watching television, we're very busy, but I think you gave us the connective tissue between the issues, the players, the history, how history is playing out right before our eyes and how the future might come about. You've connected the globe to these issues. We could have gone Middle East with you. We could have gone to so many different things. So I want to thank you for allowing us to spend some time with you. I want to thank you for providing for us context so that next time when we see something about Ukraine tomorrow, you're on the air, whatever, we'll have a much better idea of what is happening and then connect this evening to what's unfolding before our eyes sometimes or what we wake up to. And we want to know whether or not you'll come back and visit us again.
Answer is yes.
Excellent.
I would love to.
Okay.
I love it.
That's fantastic. I hope this evening was informative, that these are the type of programs that a university should hold. We should have these dialogues. We hope to have more of them. Bill, we have a token of our appreciation for your time here in the state of Alaska, certainly here in Fairbanks and UAF. It's not Marmy and Grimes. There you go. Thank you, Marm. Thank you, everybody. But you know, everybody should have a Todd Sherman, right? Everybody should have one of these.
That's
See?
right.
Right. But this is one of our friends and colleagues, one of the most celebrated artists in the state, local Fairbanks, and a dean, a scholar, a good buddy. You'll be the only kid on your block with one of these. I can guarantee it. But you should have Todd's work in your office, at your home. You just can't put candy or a salad in it. You got to hang it on the wall.
Thank you.
Bill, thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
All right, buddy.
But it's beautiful.
Beautiful?
Beautiful.
Okay. And we'll make sure we send that to you. That's not something you're going to put in the carry-on. No, we're going to send that to you. Okay.
Thank you all very much. It's been a
Ambassador
pleasure to talk to
Taylor.
you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice job.